This is how the Federal Reserve, or the Central Bank of the United States, the Fed, affects the economy by buying or selling bonds. We'll start with the origins of government bonds. A government bond is basically an IOU. The government needs money to pay for food stamps or to pay for a war. So what it does is it prints a bond, this IOU, and sells it. And the bank says, sure, we'll buy it. Here's $100. Go buy some groceries at Walmart for low-income families. And then over time, the bank then cashes in the government bond, and the government pays back the bank $100 plus interest. Basically, bonds are the government borrowing money from banks or individual households. But what if the bank did not cash in that bond? Imagine the bank loaned the money to the government and they're handling the bond, but they haven't cashed in the bond yet. So that's where we get to how the Federal Reserve can affect the economy. The Federal Reserve can step in and purchase the bond from the bank. Now the Federal Reserve is holding the IOU that they can eventually cash in with the government. So the Federal Reserve went into their vault, pulled out their actual cash, went to the bank, all the banks in America, and said, hey, we'll buy your bonds, here's some cash. Now all the banks spread throughout the United States inside their vaults, rather than having these IOUs that they really only could just cash in with the government, rather than have these pieces of paper, have a different type of piece of paper. It's a green piece of paper. It's cash in all of their vaults. All the different banks. And what do banks like to do with cash? They like to loan out the cash so that they can earn interest when people make their monthly payments on the money that banks have loaned out. Banks want the loan. Now you have all of the banks in America flooded with cash. And they all want to get that cash out of their vaults and give it out in loans. And that time, firms and households all know that the banks are filled with cash, and the banks are competing against each other. The banks, with their vaults flooded with dollar bills, are competing with each other. All banks versus banks versus banks, trying to get your loan, trying to convince you to take their bank's loan. And each bank, as they compete for the loans of various firms and various households, in order for them to win the battle to get you to be the person that takes a loan from them, they lower their interest rates. We have a high supply of cash, and that high supply forces the price down. The price of borrowing. What is the price of borrowing? The price of borrowing is your interest rate. And so the high supply now, because the Fed bought all those bonds and flooded all the banks with dollar bills, that high supply leads to a lower interest rate. And when interest rates are low, firms and households are more likely to borrow. They will borrow more. When your interest rate is 3% rather than 7%, when interest rates are lower, people borrow more. And what do you do with the money that you borrow? You spend the money that you borrow. And that spending creates economic activity. The more you spend, the more firms will have to make. And if firms have to make more goods and provide more services, they're going to hire more workers, and then those more workers spend more, and up the economy grows. But you run into one problem. As spending increases, so does demand, and we can run into inflation. Demand goes up, price goes up, inflation. So to counter inflation, when the economy gets too hot, when there is too many dollar bills in the banks and floating around in the economy, and spending is getting out of control, the Federal Reserve can hit the brakes and slow down the economy. And they do this by selling bonds. So they bought a bunch of these bonds, bought a bunch of those government IOUs. They bought them for the banks, and that put money, dollar bills in the banks. Now, if they do the opposite, if they hit the brakes, if they hit reverse, they can slow the economy down. And in doing so, they can decrease inflation. So they take the bonds now and they sell them back to the banks. Here, you can have these IOUs back. You can take these and cash them in with the government. Here it is. Now give us our money back. So in this case, the bank now is buying the IOUs. The banks are emptying their vaults. The money is flying out of the economy, flying out of the streets, getting sucked up by a giant vacuum cleaner and sucked into the Fed. And now being spit out are the IOUs, which the banks can then cash in eventually with the federal government. But now inside all the banks in America, rather than having dollar bills that they can loan out and that they can earn interest on, what they have inside their vaults are things that just kind of got to sit still, sit put. You can't loan out the bonds. You can't loan out the bonds to the firms. You can't loan out the bonds to the households. Those just got to sit there and wait for them to mature, and then the banks can eventually cash them in with the government, cash in their IOU and earn a profit. So now what has happened? Inside the vaults of all the banks across America, they're filled with bonds. There is some cash, obviously, but there's a lot more bonds now. Not as much cash. The supply of green dollar bills in all the banks, all spread out through across America, is much lower. The supply has now gone down. And when supply goes down, price goes up. And what is the price? The price of a loan is its interest rate. Now, to secure a loan among the low supply of cash available, you have to pay more. The supply is low, the price is up. Before, the banks were fighting with each other to secure loans with you. They all had money. And they all wanted to get a loan so they could earn interest. And in order to convince you to choose them, they lowered interest rates. Now, there's not a lot of banks with a lot of money. It's a low supply. The tables have turned. It has been reversed. Now you, the firms and households, are fighting with each other to win the loan because there's not a lot of money available to get. Because the banks' vaults are filled mainly with bonds. There's not a lot of dollar bills out there. So you, firms and households, are fighting against each other to try to get that loan. And in that fight, you bid against each other. Low supply, high price. That price is interest rates. You fight, I'll pay 5%. Give me the loan. I need this money. I'll pay 7%. That loan is mine. Highest bidder wins. And that forces interest rates up. And in doing so, when it's more expensive to borrow, it's like anything else, people will do less of that activity. When it's more expensive to do something, when it's more expensive to do an economic activity like borrowing, people will do less of that activity. And so loans go down. And when there are fewer loans, when there's fewer dollars going outside of the bank, that means there's fewer dollars in the streets, and that means there's less spending. And when people spend less, they purchase fewer goods, they purchase fewer services, thus firms provide fewer goods and fewer services, and that means they no longer need as many employees, so they will fire workers, and then this does lead to even less spending, which can lead to fewer goods and services and more firing, so the economy slows down. The economy decreases. The economy shrinks, which is not necessarily a great thing. This is not the complete intention of the Federal Reserve when they sell bonds. They do want to slow things down and hit the brakes. They really just want to slow growth. They want growth to continue. They just don't want it to continue rapidly. In a perfect world, when the Fed sells these bonds, the economy doesn't go in reverse, doesn't completely shrink. In a perfect world, it just slows down a little bit. And in that slowing down a little bit, in slowing growth, inflation decreases because spending decreases, demand decreases, and when demand goes down, price goes down, and prices stabilize. That is what happens when the Fed buys and sells bonds.